perhaps schedule something a little bit less accommodating of the UK next time and more accommodating of other areas in around the world. But yeah, that's all really. I was just going to welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming, and to pass you over to Laetitia. Is that all right?
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to maybe share my screen while I say hello to everyone. Yes, I wanted to just say thank you to everyone for coming today. In particular, thank you for the speakers who were really enthusiastic about doing this together. Also for the audience in the UK, I just wanted to say thank you for coming in, especially having watched the news about what's going on in the UK, and many of you about to go into industrial action, and wanted to extend solidarity for this as well. So that's it. So we're getting started. Unfortunately, Jodie is not going to be with us today, but hopefully we'll schedule something with her at a later stage. So these are the speakers. So we have Jennifer and talking about her work and Jodie's work as well. And they are in Canada on the West Coast. I don't know if I'm very accurate in where I've put you there. It's not an area that I'm very familiar with. Eric is at the College of Professional and Continuing Education at PolyU in Hong Kong. So he was telling us it's very cold at the moment. And Namala and I are at NUS at the Center for English Language and Communication. So there's a bit more about our bio there, which we shared with the abstract. But what's quite, I think, relevant for today is that we're all in the classroom, we're all practitioners, and we all use SFL to solve whatever issue we have in our classrooms with our students. So sometimes we go out of that and work with colleagues in other disciplines and help them solve their problem as well. But really we are very much practice oriented. So this is the overview then of today. We're going to start with just a broad overview of SFL as an applicable linguistics and the kinds of scholarship projects. So we're not trying to proselytize, or so we'll just tell you why we kind of find it easy to use and useful. There are a few case studies. Namala is talking about reflecting tasks in nursing. Eric about conclusions using modality. I'll probably come back in to talk about critical thinking, and Jennifer will talk about circumstances. And I mean, we can reorder that if at any time. And there will be space for a time for discussion as well. And we see this as a sort of introductory session. So hopefully in the future we can have sessions that go into more depth into these different aspects of theory, maybe more hands-on, maybe more workshop type of ResTES. Okay, but first I'm going to ask you a few questions. I'm going to put this link in the chat, so that if you want, you can answer these questions in the chat, or you could just go onto this link. Here it is. So I just thought we would start like this, just to get an idea about what kind of what do you associate SFL with. Whether you have any obstacles in using SFL, or what stops you from using it in your various contexts, and is there support for you to use it? Like if you wanted to use SFL, would you know who to ask or what to look for? Okay, so I'll just give you like a few minutes. And I think it's quite interesting, especially for us, because we're not in the UK, and so we may have a slightly different perception of how SFL is perceived. You see, let's reach the technical. You can see. I'm going to share this, by the way, while I'm here. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to answer all of them, just if anything comes to mind. Is rich and technical, and yeah. Buy-in from colleagues is often a challenge, yes. I don't know what it's like for Eric or for Jennifer, but I mean, where we work with Namala, there aren't that many people who you know, enthusiastically. So sometimes that's why actually we like doing things across continents, because sometimes in our own departments there is moderate interest. Not that we go on about it too much, hopefully. Yeah, I find it difficult. I've read quite some literature. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. There is some literature, I think, like the most famous kind of literature is also the ones that is very difficult. And so anyone going for Martin's English text or introduction or Halliday and Mathieson, I think, yeah, we'll find it very, very difficult. And terminology, okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I don't know if there's quite a lot more in the, I'll stop sharing and, okay, so you've all, that's good. You've all looked, okay, so let's hope we don't make it worse today with our presentation. I think, yeah, I'll try to emphasize how much the overall architecture is comprehensive and detailed and so on, but what we need for our own problems and our own scholarship is not necessarily the whole thing either. So we need to be quite careful not to you know, not to want to know everything before we actually use it. So let's start. Thank you so much for all this. We can go back to those points in the discussion. So I have three, four slides. That's all on the actual theory, so that we relate it to usefulness for scholarship. SFL is an applicable linguistics, so that means we use it to investigate real world problems, in our case, teaching and learning. It's based on the premise that language and context are interdependent, so we make choices from this system according to the context. We see language as SFL sees language as a system of resources to make meaning, so not a set of rules. And a very important element is that language choices construe our social world and our social relations, so they both reflect and construct the social world. And alongside with this broad kind of ontological view on language, there's also this very comprehensive architecture that links the social context to language, and those two key theoretical concepts, which are that language is multi-stratal, so we can describe resources from whole text to word level, and metafunctional, which means that language expresses different types of meanings. Okay, so these are really the core theoretical underpinnings. So that's just one slide for each of these main points. So SFL then conceptualizes language as a resource that is multi-stratal. So we can look at resources at whole text, at sentence level, at word level, and we make language choices depending on context, and that is not necessarily conscious either. So for us practitioners, it's quite useful because it provides us a systematic way for to analyze the various contexts of communication. So the disciplinary context and the type of discourse our students are exposed to, and etc., while always linking it to the disciplinary context and beyond. And the next element is that SFL conceptualizes language as performing 4 main functions. So I've written 4 here. It's often 3, but the ideational meta function can be looked at from those 2 angles. Experiential, which is all the resources that express the fields, the concepts. Logical are the resources that look at how those concepts relate. Then we have resources to express all the interpersonal meanings. And then finally, the resources that are used to organize the message and the text. Okay, so these 2 things together give us this type of mapping of resources. So if we put those 2 like theoretical constructs together with the strata at the top, and then on the left, the meta functions, then we can populate the cells with the type of resources that are relevant in those at that cross section. So for example, if we want to have a look at how our students are talking about or writing about their field, we'll look at transitivity, we'll look at participants, logical semantic relations. If we're interested in the type of evaluative meanings they express, we might look at attitude or engagement if we want to see how they engage with other sources. So today we have Jennifer is going to talk to us about circumstance, and then Eric is talking about modality, and Namala is talking about attitude. So we will just focus into one of these aspects, but basically this is what we mean by comprehensive architecture. And each of these little bits has, and I've done this quite quickly, so I haven't really looked at what I've missed, but each of these bits then has a lot of theoretical work behind it, and probably some debates and probably some arguments, and it has a lot of applied work as well. So each time we isolate a specific question, then we can go into that area of the theory without necessarily having a massive amount of knowledge about the rest. So that's one way to kind of feel a bit less intimidated about SFL. Okay, so this then shows how I think SFL is very useful for discourse analysis, and it is a very common tool in discourse analysis. So Halliday used to say this, that discourse analysis that is not based on grammar is not an analysis at all. So we don't have to argue over that, whether we completely agree or not, but the access into the actual language patterns is very useful because it gives us really objective description of patterns in specific contexts. So rather than staying maybe at a sort of content analysis level, we can go a little bit deeper to really see what people are doing with language. And in that way, it's very useful as well to operationalize social theories or other concepts that we might be interested in. So we might be looking at agency or identity or any sort of issues that concern our field. And with SFL, that kind of gives us that kind of a tool to kind of visualize and operationalize those concepts in our data. So I think I'm nearly done. The last part for me is just to have a look at the types of scholarship projects that SFL can be useful for. I think it's quite useful to look at the type of problems first. So maybe working from a problem, not necessarily a problem in a narrow sense, but maybe just something we want to understand a bit more in our practice. So it could be related to our classroom practices, specific assignments, our assessment, student perceptions about any kind of issue, our collaboration with the disciplines, or specific things like critical thinking or impact or inclusivity and so on. Or, as I just said, maybe more sociologically oriented problems as well. once we have that, or it happens at the same time, but then we're kind of looking at the discourses around that issue. So that could be in the form of student assignments. For example, we might be looking at the basis of achievement in an EAP task or an ESP task in order to reveal what is needed. That's what I will show you actually for my my section. We might be consulting with the discipline, so looking at their data, their assignments, their syllabus, and so on. We might do all sorts of more ethnographic type of approaches, like interviews and talk around text, or look at the wider kind of context, like institutional or policies, or that type of discourse as well. So once we have that, then we need to have a look at what SFL tool is relevant to our question. So what's really salient? That's why at this point it's quite useful to know a little bit of the map, so we can notice which are coming up as being very significant. So it could be circumstance, or it could be transitivity. It could be something that we see students are doing very differently, so we know that's something to dig into a little bit more. But basically, as that kind of makes us a discourse analyst in our classroom, right? So we are asking the questions: what choices were made, why were they made, what difference would other choices make in this text, and so on. And finally, the results then, well, can feed back into the classroom. So you might revise your assignments, you might revise your rubrics, and so on. Or you might also hopefully do a broader dissemination through publication at disciplinary or field level for a wider impact. But basically, it's quite useful to see it as a kind of solving a problem. I think I'm done, so that's good. It wasn't too long. So, so we're going to start now with those 4 case studies, and we'll take 15 minutes each. So it's not too bad. We'll see whether we want to take a break in the middle, or we take a break after, and then come back for the questions. If the speakers have any preference, you just let me know in the chat. So I'll stop sharing. And Jenny, yes, lovely. We can recommend some interesting. Yes, there's Thompson, and there's the kind of Australian equivalent with Susan Eggins as well. They're quite interesting to look at the same time. Okay, Namala, if you're ready to share, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Everyone will just have to be a bit patient. I've just got a bit of a cold. It's a terrible thing to say nowadays, isn't it? You've got a cold. It just automatically means that, you know, something horrible. You got to go and get a test done and hope that it's not something awful. All right. So I'm just going to share my slides. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So what I'm going to basically talk about today is using SFL to enhance critical reflection in nursing. And I'm just going to show you the cycle of a project that we went through at NUS. So this project was myself, Laetitia, and Dr. Mark Brook, all of us working at CELC. And I'm just going to show you how we used SFL amongst many other tools. But today I'm going to be focusing on appraisal, attitude, and show you how we use that to enhance critical reflection in nursing in undergraduate students who are in their first clinical placement. So today's focus, as Laetitia just introduced us to, is looking at how systemic functional linguistics can be used to enhance EAP teaching and research. We're going to look at how we initially started with research on nursing discourse in undergraduate critical reflection, and then how we then designed a pedagogical intervention using SFL to improve critical reflection. So some of these questions that you were asking about, how much technicality, how much expertise do you need to have, the kinds of things that you were putting up on the Google Doc in terms of your concerns about SFL, I'm hoping that we can show you just how you can navigate that through the kind of project that we did. So the project is a collaborative interdisciplinary research project with the Alice Lee Center for Nursing Studies, and it was supported by a teaching enhancement grant. So we were basically approached by lecturers from nursing at NUS, and they came and told us, look, we're having some issues with critical reflection, which we think is a very useful kind of assignment for our students to engage in, particularly when they're first-year undergraduate nurses going into the clinical placements for the first time. So this is the first time that they're, for instance, engaging in fundamentals of nursing. So bathing patients, dressing their wounds, incredibly emotional and quite difficult physical aspects of nursing care. So what we did was we first did a pre-intervention in the project where we basically said, okay, give us your student assignments, just let us have a look at what students are doing in these assignments, critical reflection assignments. And then we were looking at it just from a disciplinary perspective, asking the disciplinary lecturers, what are the high scoring assignments, what are the middle scoring assignments, and what are the assignments that were less successful. We had focus group discussions with the lecturers about why they thought assignments scored better, some assignments scored better than others. And then based on an SFL and as LCT, and as some of you might be familiar with LCT as well, we basically brought together what we thought were resources of successful critical reflection, and then we created an intervention out of that and a series of pedagogical materials. So I'm just going to show you some of that process. We analyzed about 155 scripts. Again, they were ranked according to low, mid, high, not with our intervention at all. At this stage, it was just the nursing lecturers sort of intuitively and with a rubric of theirs deciding what they thought was high-level critical reflection. And then all we wanted to know was what are some of the resources that students are using in these kinds of reflections to try and derive a rubric that we could then develop it into pedagogical materials. So the critical reflection assignment that the students were given was select an incident that you found problematic or difficult, think about what went wrong, and then use the sections in Gibbs reflective cycle to think of some ideas that could help you plan or map out your reflection and think about how you could better change your practice in the future. So the Gibbs reflective cycle, frequently used in nursing, goes through a number of different stages: description, what happened; feelings, what were they thinking while they were engaging with a particular incident; evaluation, was this a good or bad experience; analysis, a particularly challenging part, how can you make sense of this particular situation; and then moving on to what else could you have done, what could you do differently. So the students were given a pretty comprehensive framework, but the lecturers felt that there were still some issues when they were engaging with this task, which is that the students were predominantly descriptive rather than being analytical. I mean, these are the kinds of problems that critical reflection literature in general points out. The move towards being more descriptive than being analytical. There was no attempt at what lecturers call deep reflection, and no connection of practice to theory. So for us, this question of deep reflection was one that kept coming up, and we wanted to know, what does that mean and how does that map out linguistically? So we turned to SFL to try and figure that out. So this is from a focus group discussion court. One of the lecturers said, when you reflect, it's not just about remembering, it's about trying to make sense of events. So what does that mean and how does that map out in the language? So one of the things that comes up in the literature a lot is this idea that reflective writing tasks are quite different from traditional tasks. So traditional objective assignment that students are supposed to write. So one of the things that emerges is this bringing in the personal and emotional concerns and engaging with that in relation to theoretical content, really challenging. Any of you who have written critical reflections? Me and Laetitia are supposed to write one for a professional development course that we're doing, and it's incredibly difficult to do this kind of engaging with the personal and subjective. And students often find it quite difficult. What does it mean, for instance, to deconstruct personal assumptions? So our questions were, how are personal and subjective ways of making sense of events realized in text? Are there differences, we asked, in the way in which low and high scoring students engage with the personal and subjective? Could we see patterns emerging in the way that high scoring students were expressing their emotions and judgments, for instance? And then questions about how can we make this visible to students and explicitly teach these strategies back to students so that they can understand how better to convey personal subjective meanings in a valued manner in the discipline of nursing. So we moved to the appraisal framework in SFL. So this is Martin and White. To a certain extent, we looked at a simplified version of it, which was just, and this is something I taught my research assistants as well. So first, dividing a text up into what are the emotions that you can see, anything that's evaluative, but then I make a distinction between emotions and opinions at the most basic level, saying, okay, how do you feel about something versus how do you assess someone's behavior? How do you judge someone's behavior? And so we basically said, all right, try and find, we'll try and find what kinds of evaluative patterns emerge and try to make a distinction between how students engage with emotion and opinion in these particular types of assignments. So this is just an example of the kind of assignment that we looked at, and that was sort of coded by our research assistants. So I'm just going to start with a stronger sample and then show you what kind of resources we could see emerging, and then show you how we tried to develop that into sort of teachable resources. So at the very basic level, the research assistants were just trying to find anything that was considered evaluative, and then trying to determine, is it emotion? So the emotion is in pink, coded in pink, and then is anything, if it's judgment, it's coded in green. And they made a distinction sometimes between something is explicitly realized in the text. It was a clear, explicit realization of a particular emotion. So I was anxious, rather than, metaphorically saying I have the jitters or something like that, which would express the same thing, but wasn't explicit in a sense. So they would make a distinction between that at times. But overall, they could see the patterns emerging in terms of how I was feeling versus how I would judge someone else's behavior or my own behavior, for instance. So what we wanted to really do, first of all, after mapping out emotions and opinions, was to start to think about, were they coalescing around particular targets or particular people who were feeling those emotions, particular people who were being judged overwhelmingly. And we tried to determine how those particular types of meaning were spread out across a text. So in the first instance, for example, if we have a look, we can see that the student talks about their feelings. I was eager to perform the task. I was anxious. I was concerned. So one of the predominant patterns that we could see across the stronger samples was that students would talk about concern, uncertainty, fear when they enter the clinical space for the first time. Not surprising at all, because it's a very daunting task for them. They've learned about the theory, and now they actually have to go and engage with patients and in quite confronting situations. So, negative emotions plus the student nurse was one of the patterns of meaning that sort of emerged in relation to emotions. Then another pattern that we could see was the students talking about what they could and couldn't do in relation to helping the patient. So they were judging themselves in terms of their capacity. So I could only assist, I could not walk freely around. So generally students would talk about what they couldn't do to help their students or alleviate their pain or to stop their suffering or to provide them with adequate care. And that emerged as sort of another, a group of meanings. So the students nurses generally tended in the stronger samples and across many samples that we looked at, one of the patterns that emerged was their inability to sort of provide sufficient care for their patients. And that comes across as a sort of negative judgment of themselves. Then students would also say things about what their clinical instructors were doing in these practice situations. They would talk about how they're very patient, they helped alleviate their anxiety, they taught them something. And this emerged as another pattern of meaning, which was positive evaluation of positive judgment of clinical instructors. So they would generally talk about doctors, other nurses, and how they helped them in terms of overcoming some of the difficulties that they were having in these situations. And then in some instances, the students would also, rather than just talking about what they couldn't do and negatively evaluating themselves, some students would also go on to positively evaluate their own efforts. So this student, for instance, right at the bottom says, having a systematic approach towards a task helped me stay more organized and focused. So they show that once the clinical instructor intervenes, they're able to perform their job better. So they give themselves positive evaluation. So across the assignments, we could see these kinds of patterns emerging, which was comforting to know that, okay, we know that there are certain types of evaluative meanings that were being used by students who were scoring very high on these kinds of assignments, who were showing their capacity to navigate across multiple different types of evaluative meaning, and were able to understand that the task was about sharing how they performed in this clinical space. So this was quite different from what we found in the lower sort of banded texts, the weaker samples. So we found instances like this one, which was classic, which was that the student would talk about the patient. All right, so you can see another pattern emerging here. All of the negative judgment, the patient could only speak in Hokkien as a Hokkien speaker. I was assigned to, I'll talk about that in a minute. The patient was withdrawn. She seemed like an abused patient. She was an abused patient. So the student is consistently evaluating the patient and projecting particular values onto the patient. So that would emerge as one cluster of meaning that we could see in weaker samples. Even in the focus group, the nursing lecturers were very straightforward about this. They said, look, the students can't project emotions onto the patient. That's not appropriate, particularly at this stage when they're first entering this space. Another pattern that you could see was that the students were negatively evaluating other nurses in the weaker samples. So they'll say things like, none of the other nurses talked to her, or the other nurses didn't speak to her kindly, or they didn't do a particular procedure well. Okay, again, the clinical instructors and the nursing staff were not happy with that. They said, look, the purpose is to think about your own practice because it's self-reflection and not necessarily about others, unless you could link it to your own practice in a meaningful way. And then finally, the student would say slightly positive things about themselves in the context of others' mistakes and shortcomings, in a sense. So they would say things like, you know, I could speak Hokkien. I really tried to help her. I tried to assist her. I'm the one who understood that she was incapable of doing something or she needed help, and I came forward to do that. And they would positively judge themselves. So positive judgment towards their own actions was not necessarily a bad thing, but negative judgment of certain people, certain types of targets in these particular instances were considered inappropriate, such as judging the patient and trying to think about the patient's emotional state and judging other nurses and clinical practitioners. So how would we map this out onto actually teaching the students this kind of material? What we did was we would have an annotated text extract, just like the one that I showed you, and then we would have a description of what that means. And we would actually provide the students this in the material. So we would say, okay, so this is an example of a slightly weaker student, and these are some of the things that they were doing. So you know, the student was using emotion to refer to how the patient was feeling and attributes to the patient's negative feelings to other staff. So we're trying to point out that there were certain patterns of meaning that were not as valued as maybe what some of the higher scoring students were using. And in the materials, we would try to explain what this is, so that we were trying to use the knowledge that came out of explicitly looking at the resources that we used that emerged when we did appraisal analysis, and then try to develop it into teaching materials, which would help students understand what was valued or not valued in the discipline. We also reflected this in the rubric. So we showed students, for instance, across the different stages, and I know I've run out of my time, so I'm just going to wrap up now, but just to show that we talked about, look, in the critical incident stage, for instance, this is how you would use evaluative language. We showed them this in the rubric. We showed this to the lecturers as well. So in this instance, you would, for example, in this stage, talk about negative, positive, evaluation of your own capacity, ability, confidence, insecurity. So we're being very explicit about the patterns that we could see emerging. And of course, we corroborated that with the literature in the field as well. But we could have kept it at the most basic level. What are the positive feelings and behaviors? What are the negative feelings and behaviors, and how do they emerge in different parts of the assignment? So in conclusion, really for us in this particular project, using SFL appraisal to analyze the student text, just to look at evaluative meaning, revealed where and how students use these emotions and opinions. It allowed for comparison of high and low scoring texts and understanding what was valued by disciplinary lecturers, but also to enable visible pedagogy. So showing students what was valued, where appraisal is located in the text, and how it allows students to effectively engage with what the subjective and the personal. And SFL enabled us as EAP practitioners to show how language is used to make sense of events and to demonstrate in-depth and quality critical reflection in a discipline that's quite different from our own. So that's what we were able to do in that project with SFL. So I'm just going to hand it over to Eric, or is there any time for questions, or do we just go straight to Eric? Thank you so much. I mean, if anyone has questions, you can just type them up for me and then keep a track. Thanks, Eric. You are up. I will stop sharing.
Yeah, shall we carry on, and then we can put the questions in the chat and pick up, and then after Eric, maybe we decide whether we have a few minutes break.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and bear with me if I'm just trying to see Okay, can you all see the slides? Okay, all good. So this is my topic, and before I move on to the a little bit more technical parts, let me introduce myself first and my background. So I come from Hong Kong, and I teach a group of non-native English users at the associate degree level. So by associate degree level, that means they are in the community college after taking the what we call the DSE exam, the Diploma of Secondary Education. And they are not taking the usual pathway to go to the university straight ahead. So they are more in the transition phase, trying to equip themselves with the necessary literacy skills before moving on. So I am teaching a group of business students in a big teaching team of an EAP compulsory subject at the community college. So aside from being using the convenient sample, I also figure out the reasons why I will use AD students writing, because usually when they were doing their secondary schooling, the most common type of text would be essays. So 5-paragraph essays with topics such as argumentative ones or explanatory ones. And these are like fundamental skills that they have to master before moving on to community colleges or to universities. So AD students writing would be some kind of a bridge between the secondary and the tertiary before they move on to more advanced writing, more full-fledged essay or term papers. And these students are may not be very proficient in the language, but they are very, very eager for articulation. That means they want to go back to the what we call the government-funded universities. So they are very hardworking. They want to brush up their language, but they need to know how to, because all we are, can we say, feeding them would be the academic writing skills and the structures and the formatting or the separate or individual grammatical items. So for example, when we teach explanatory essays, that is what I am going to explain to you in a minute. There would be grammatical or lexical markers such as therefore, the transition markers such as therefore, because, and why they should use these and why they shouldn't. And sometimes they feel quite detached from this kind of grammatical teaching or learning, and they want something more. And they want some kind of examples or a clearer explanation as to why I can't use particular features. Because usually what we do as teachers in Hong Kong, maybe, according to my experience, would be when they ask why, all we are trying to say would be, that's the way it is. And you have to figure things out yourselves. But I was thinking, would there be any ways or more informed ways of figuring out what we call the conventions, in that they are so-called allowed to use particular features and whatnot? Okay, so I did a little study, and I took 40 high-graded and low-graded cause and effect essays from these students. And the topics vary, but they are based on the business-related topic, which will have implications for Hong Kong business or Hong Kong context. Okay, and I focus on the conclusion section. And you can see the average word count would be, for the high-graded ones, there would be more words. And usually the advice that we are giving them for writing conclusions would be, you don't simply repeat what you have said in the conclusion. Okay, for the lower graded ones, you can see that either they would copy and paste directly the thesis statement from the introduction. I mean, direct copying. Sometimes you can expect that, or sometimes they even leave the conclusion out. So that's why you can see the differences in word count. And I've also done this research and reported in the publication. And the complexity of the conclusion, as I said, interests me because somehow when they are explaining a business phenomenon, like we have very small flats in Hong Kong, people buy very small flats, we call nano flats, and we've got some long-term or large-scale infrastructure projects in the on the outlying islands in Hong Kong near the airport. So they are going to explain the causes or effects or the consequences of these phenomena. And after explaining the factors or the consequences of these phenomena, they are going to wrap up their ideas and give final comments. As you can see in the in this slide, this is a conclusion section or concluding paragraph of the 5-paragraph essays that they are asked to write. So in purple color, you can see the writer was trying to wrap up the whole idea of the essay by restating the thesis statement. So somehow I have taught them how to paraphrase and not directly copying the thesis statement word for word. So you can see like the Lantau Tomorrow vision brings a lot of positive effects by creating the quality new business district, the entrepôt, and also business or job opportunities. And towards the very end of the whole essay, they are also asked to give final comments. For example, opinions, what they think about the issue, and perhaps give some suggestions or predictions. And this kind of writing also requires their generalizing skills, how they are going to pack everything unfolded from the body paragraphs into one small paragraph and then give a final comment. And I don't hope to oversimplify the matter because when students are summarizing their ideas and comments in the conclusion, they would use a couple of language features like attitudinal lexis for evaluating the phenomena, as Namala has just talked about appraisal or attitude. And sometimes they will also need to cite and reference to give evidence. Okay, this may not appear in the conclusion, but throughout the text, they may have to do this kind of citation works in order to show that they have done their homework and all the arguments they have put forward would not just be their own point of view. And by that, they also need to adjust the likelihood or the certainty or how assertive they are towards particular arguments. So that's why I start from something small first to see how they are using modality in order to engage readers. Because for modality, it's not just the modal verbs that we are talking about, like may, must, should. And these kinds of modality will also involve semi-modals, need to have to, adverbials, perhaps, indeed, adjectives. But then, when we are teaching students why we are not going to use I think or I believe, sometimes it would be because we are not allowed to use I's. We are not allowed to express what we think. But I remember a colleague once told me the essence or the main or the whole point of the essay is that it is written from your own voice. So instead of telling them what they cannot do, I'd rather tell them what the choices are out there. So I adopted the modality framework by talking about how they are orientating their points of views or their positions or their presence in the text. So for example, and you can see these features like subjective, objective, they are pretty straightforward. By subjective, it means the agency of the statement or the sentence would start from the author himself or herself. So expressions such as "I think that," or "I believe that," or "we believe that" would be regarded as subjective. Okay, and then the agency that are hidden or they are not explicit would be sorry. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out. So we will use the we will hide the agency with expressions such as "it is possible." Okay, and then we also have choices or options such as the implicit features, and these features would be, for example, modal verbs like may or might or should. Because when we talk about implicit, it means that it is embedded inside the statement. But for explicit features, like "I think that," it is like a projecting clause with the "that" clause following the "I think." Okay, so with these choices in mind, or with these options in mind, so I may tell the students that instead of saying "I think," there are alternatives out there. Because when we ask you what you think about this issue, or do you agree with this issue, we actually do not expect them to answer directly or straightforwardly by saying "I think" or "we believe" in the essays. But there are choices out there. So I made a comparison between the high-graded text as well as the low-graded text to see to compare the distribution or the frequencies of the use of these modality features. So here is a rough comparison. So you can see most of them would use the most straightforward ones, the modal verbs, because that's what we have taught them to use generally to adjust their strength of arguments. But then you can also see there are more implicit objective. That means the adverbs, adverbials, with the low-graded ones. And you can also see that there are more students using explicit objectives in the low-graded text. But I will also be interested in knowing that aside from the distribution, aside from the frequencies, would there be particular patterns in the high-graded and low-graded text in that the patterning or the consistency of the modality choice would kind of tell the difference between the two kinds of text? So I will give you two quick examples. So this is the high-graded text, and you can see the beginning of the conclusion would be the opinion of the writer, but it's hidden inside the statement with the modal verb "can." So Lantau Tomorrow Vision, the infrastructure project, can boost the advantage of Hong Kong business. And then moving on, after like summarizing the whole points in the whole essay, the writer moves on to give recommendations. So you can see the shift in the modal responsibility. So when you use modal verbs with the verb, the subject would usually either be the author himself or herself, or other parties that are involved in a particular business phenomenon, like this one. So many benefits the policy have. Hong Kong should support this plan. So the recommendation would be the Hong Kong's responsibility. And then moving on towards the end of the text, we have a prediction. If we don't change, our advantage and competitiveness will be reduced. So it's a kind of prediction, and we can see that the responsibility has shifted from Hong Kong as a whole to more personally we. And then moving on to the end, also a kind of prediction, and then zooming back out to the responsibility of Hong Kong. So it also fulfills some kind of the expectations that we have on effective student writing, in that aside from talking about this specific phenomena inside the essay itself, we also hope that the students are able to zoom out of the issue and look at the bigger picture. So we can see from the modality choices, we can also find out how they are shifting the ones who are held accountable. And then the low-graded text would be something like this. Although the first two instances of modality, like it is true that the growth in health food market can provide job opportunities. So it's the author's modal responsibility because it's what he or she thinks about the issue. But then having the relatively stronger modality at the beginning of the the conclusion, you can see the modality weakened in the middle. The downsides mentioned above could lead to a great financial burden. So at the beginning, we have a stronger opinion or stronger positioning. We expect that the writer can hold the positions more firmly in that they use more consistent modality features. But then, having said that, as we expect the authors, the writers to be assertive, you can see there are some kind of overcommitment towards the end when the writer tries to give recommendations to the government who may not be reading our essays. So the government surely has the responsibility to strengthen the surveillance of health food commercial events and so on. And then there is also a misuse of modality. Okay, so through this little research that I have done, I know that teaching grammatical items would not just be the teaching of individual features and explaining to them that this is the way that you guys should be using modality. For example, you are changing the assertiveness of your statements, and we should also tell them that you should look at the bigger picture, how you are using modality to maintain the consistency of modality. And aside from that, we can also use the modality framework to tell them about the expression of different perspectives without having to explicitly saying I or we in the text. Well, of course, it's not to say that using I's or we's are problematic. It's just that what kind of collocations we are expecting using the I's with. Okay, I think that's all from me. And thank you so much for listening to a little sharing from me. And shall I pass the floor back to Laetitia or Jennifer?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Eric. I think Jennifer is going to take over now.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So I am talking about circumstances. This is presenting work on behalf of my colleague, Jodie Martin, and I have been doing a little bit of different work looking specifically at circumstances. And so my plan is to get to circumstances very soon through a couple of key concepts and components via a couple of purposeful detours. So I'll give an overview of some clausal components and then getting to circumstances. I'll do a detour through the arts, which is where I teach, and then to science, which is where Jodie teaches. We'll take a look at some shared features and our research focus going forward. Most of what I'm sharing with you today are student-facing resources for our first-year students. As I said, mine are in arts. They're first-year students at the University of British Columbia, and they have a full course load. Jodie teaches in science, and her students have a full science course load. And so we're offering discipline-specific, or ESAP, language courses informed by SFL and genre theory. So in early lectures, we emphasize that all three meta functions concomitantly manifest in every text. While we might focus our attention on a particular meta function for a particular lesson, the three interact. The focus on circumstances is primarily in the ideational meta function, the focus being on the ideas or content of a text. The textual refers to the organization and the mode of a text, and the interpersonal positioning, the relations between text, author, and the audience. SFL likes circles. So within that ideational meaning, we have three clausal components: processes, participants, and circumstances. And these circles here in the bullseye shows how these three components interact with one another. And when we talk about these with students, we very much focus on what they do in the clause. So the first being the process. It is the nucleus of the clause. No process, no clause. And they're typically realized by verbs or verbal groups. Then we have our participants, and they are the participants in that process. There may be none, or it may be understood. If we say sit down, we understand that the participant is you. There may be one, two, or even more participants. And they are typically realized by nouns or noun groups, but they may also be realized as adjectives when we're describing. When I say I am tired, that tired adjective is an attribute that's participating in my being, how I am. And lastly, our focus on circumstances. And these are to modify the process in when or how or under what circumstances or context the process is occurring. And they tend to be realized by prepositional phrases, some adverbs, and a few noun groups. So let's take a look at how I show this with students in contextualized student-facing texts. So this is an excerpt from The Guardian for my writing class focused on food and the environment. And here I've bracketed the groups from the outset into those processes, participants, and circumstances, starting with the process, the nucleus of the clause, what's happening, realized by those verbal groups. Some are quite simple, like are, and some are groups. They may be active, they may be passive. But these is what I show to the students. And then we'll take a look at the participants that are involved in that process. Typically nouns, but we may also have adjectives or even locations, which might look like a circumstance, but it's still participating in the process. Well, they might even be repeated. So looking at pronoun usage, or even elided when repeated in this compound complex sentence. And our circumstances. These modify the process. As I said, typically realized as prepositional phrases. They can be big or short, or they may also be adverbs and some noun groups. They tell us what accompanies the process, the period of time they take, how they occur, and all sorts of other contextual relevant information. You may have noticed that some things didn't get color-coded. These are our conjunctions and logical connectors that are between the processes, participants, and circumstances. Something important to realize is that we can omit the circumstances and the clauses are still grammatically intact. We can still read full sentences here that consumers tend to overbuy and fail to eat all the products they produced. Because these things are perishable, they're left uneaten or thrown out. It's still grammatically intact, which is one reason that much more attention tends to go to processes and participants because they are central to the clause. But these circumstances do add relevant contextualizing detail about when, how, where, why, and other circumstances about the process. In this excerpt here, they indicate significant factors for consumer behavior and food waste. This is an excerpt from students' history readings. Earlier in a lesson, we first looked at the monster noun groups and identified the head noun, which I've bolded here. And this ended up with these boiled down clauses. Whoops. So that the discipline opened to inclusion and the profession began to admit women, minorities, and immigrants. But we might ask some pertinent questions about when or how or to where these fields progressed. So we go from condensing core meaning to expanding for contextualized meaning. And this is to indicate and to drive home the relevance of these extra details that really make for a fulsome discussion. So many of us are from form-focused backgrounds, myself included. So talking about the form, as I acknowledge, there are some noun groups. They are quite limited and they tend to refer to time. We also have adverbs or adverbials. These are more typically related to manner or how something is done, but there's also some important ones for angle and viewpoint. And as I'll return to in a moment, more prepositional phrases as well. There's also a key aspect of the movement test. Because circumstances illuminate the process, it can be on either side and sometimes even insert itself in the middle. So we've got our core process, we've got the participant in it, and then we've got this long prepositional phrase that really functions as a circumstance. And this can be a little bit confusing to students because it is just so big, and that movement test can be really helpful to see that it is actually functioning to illuminate the compounding. How and where was this problem compounded? So back to those prepositional phrases. So to know that there's a lot of information packed into the noun group component of the prepositional phrase. What's key is that a circumstance is not a clause. There is no process. It's talking about the process without having one within it. Function-wise, they contextualize how, where, despite what, and more information about what has happened. Because there are so many circumstances, 9 in Halliday's text and 20 subtypes, it can be really hard to keep track. And I've always found the probe questions helpful to interrogate the meaning. So when talking about the extent of something, its duration, frequency, or distance, we're asking questions like for how long or how many times or how far. Looking at a particular point or location, either in time or place, we're asking at what point, when, or where did this occur? For manner, means, quality, comparison, degree, and these are the ones that often show up as adverbials, we're asking by what means or how, what's it like or how much. For the cause, be it the reason, the purpose, or behalf, we're asking why or for what purpose, on whose behalf. Contingency, very important for logic, condition, concession, and default. In what circumstances did this occur or under what conditions, despite what or lacking what? For concomitant or additive accompaniment, together with, who or what else? For role, guise, or product, what as or what into. And I do find helpful talking about disguise and getting it to the meaning of guise. And matter, what's it about? And lastly, angle, the source or viewpoint of something. Whose angle, or says who, or from whose perspective. So in student-facing tasks, at the basic level is to have students identify circumstances and their type, referring to a comprehensive list of these types and the probe questions. And this can help indicate what type of information is valued in the field. And where they are can be important too. Certain tasks help students realize different circumstances are associated with different purposes. And then using those probe questions to interrogate what is or maybe should be in a text. And through this work, these are some of the patterns that I've noted in the disciplines that I've been teaching with. So in history, of course, a lot of asking about when and where, but also who or what with, or on whose behalf, and very importantly, particularly in political science, from whose perspective. Last year, I started working with psychology and a lot more attention on what this was like and why and under what conditions an experiment occurred. So I find this quote from the literature particularly helpful, enhancing precision and identifying constraints or conditions. And to that end, we look for details with those probe questions. So this is an excerpt from students' geography text. Its key idea is that language builds place. But we can look more closely at that text by asking these probe questions. Despite what, or from whose or which perspective, and by what means. Asking those probe questions are also helpful to interrogate a text as to what might or should be there. This is an excerpt from student psychology text. And I wanted to show how the probe questions could generate critical thinking by not only identifying what was in the text, but by interrogating it. So the first that come to mind are related to time. How long does it take for a brain to go from sensation to perception? For how long can a brain do this without fatiguing? The conclusion of the final paragraph discusses damage. By what means might someone's visual processing centers be damaged? What else might be damaged in the same way? And under what conditions might they be repaired or recover? This is a task for a writing course where all students were given the same image, but different groups had to write different text types, incorporating different circumstances. So for students who had to describe the scene, they were using circumstances of time, duration, location, manner of occurrence, or tools or instruments involved, and comparison perhaps to other events. Students who were tasked with explaining what was happening, they were referring to conditions, reasons, consequence, and manner of occurrence. And those to make recommendations were looking at the purpose and the beneficiaries of those recommendations, as well as various viewpoints on those recommendations. My colleague and co-author Jodie Martin teaches in the science stream, where her focus on circumstances in science is part of an overall focus on technicality and precision. So reviewing students' needs, they were mostly reading textbooks, so she focused on clause forms and logic to help unpack the language of textbooks, which often packs in a lot of detail through embedded clauses in all sorts of circumstances. So back to processes and their participants. This murder scene is more detective work than mathematics. A wealthy man was found murdered. The temperature of his body was 33 degrees and the room was 21. And the temperature of the body was 31. Assume the body cools. When we look at the circumstances, we realize that they're fundamentally necessary for solving word problems and prepositional phrases to the rescue. So here we've got specific reference to, according to Newton's law of cooling, this is really relevant to solving the mathematics example involving physics. These are examples that Jodie pulled from 1 week of students' readings. We note a variety of form. We've got our prepositional phrases, but also some adverbials, different types, and also location, some at the end, in the middle, and at the beginning. And we also note that we can have more than one circumstance following one another. So revisiting the concept of these meta functions all co-occurring in text, recall that one of the tests of a prepositional phrase being a circumstance or not is whether it can move around the clause or not. Those that can move, those are the circumstances. That said, most circumstances occur at the end. When they are fronted, we say that they are marked or unusual. So when we front them, we tend to be focusing the attention or a topic shift or setting up relevant knowledge schemata to frame and solve a problem. So here we see the overlap of the ideational circumstances functioning textually to focus and shift the attention in a text of the textual metafunction. And more circles. I've been doing some work and wrote a paper in 2019 on using grammatical metaphor for paraphrasing. Dreyfus and Bennett wrote a paper in 2017 arguing for recognizing circumstantial information beyond the ranking circumstance and up-ranking to a dependent clause or down-ranking into some post-modification within the noun group, or even further condensation into an adjective of pre-modification within the noun group. And we liken that to the matryoshka dolls of intersecting in layers and layers of meaning. Playing with this in our pedagogy led Jodie and me to incorporate some of our teaching practices in our 2021 paper, A Happy Instance of Praxis Informing Research. It's the idea of expanding our students' attention above and below strict ranking circumstances. So focusing on logic and circumstances together lets students compare and combine them for grammatical metaphor and practice paraphrasing and condensing language. So while circumstances are not grammatically integral, we found them interesting to think about and really helpful to focus on in our pedagogy. And this is a summarizing slide from a lecture looking at the circumstantial information and how students can use it in interrogating and expanding and critically analyzing their texts. To that end, here are some of the circumstance-specific resources I'd like to point you towards, including our presentation to the SFL Interest Group International Conference last year with a YouTube video and the paper that I mentioned on paraphrasing, and well of other references, resources referenced in this presentation. So there we are. Do please feel free to get in touch. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. This is using a bit of SFL for understanding critical thinking in texts. So this is the problem I started with. The problem was, so the context is a CLIL module that I teach here. And the problem was a recurrent issue with students not really understanding an assignment which is called a critical response to a reading. Not all students, but every semester a sizable portion of the students engaging with the source texts in a strange manner. Basically, I'm sure I know other colleagues have observed that in their students' engagement with sources. They kind of dismissed the study altogether, just saying, well, it's just there's nothing there. And so despite the fact that I kind of told them, you know, critical thinking is not about criticizing, it's not about dismissing, I don't think I was getting through. I'm not sure if I'm still getting through anyway. So what happened was I thought, in order to understand this better, I'll look at the students who are doing this very well and I'm happy with it, and the students who are not. And of course, we can get a sort of intuition about it, but it doesn't really. What we need is looking at the language carefully and really find what is different across the two bands. And so after just looking at a little bit of the data, it was clearly attitude and engagement that was used very differently in those texts. So I'll show you the results, but then the results fed into pedagogic intervention. So I actually got the students to analyze the text to see what I was expecting. So I highlighted that in the teaching. And also it led me to a broader reflection about critical thinking in my context in Singapore and elsewhere, and what impacts our students and shapes the kind of texts that they write around critical thinking. So these are the tools that I used. So Namala just talked about opinion for judgment and appreciation, and also engaging with other sources. So these were the two areas that were very useful. And when I looked at opinion or expressing judgment, something that was really important in that two sets of assignments was the target. So what they engaged with was very different. And so, not very surprisingly, I think, there were two main targets: the field of research, so anything to do with the methodology of the core article, or the actual subject matter, the field of study, so the findings and so on. And so the high achieving assignments engaged with the positions in the field of study and used a lot of engagement resources, mostly in that case aligning resources. On the other hand, the lower achieving assignments were mostly concerned, but the difference was very, very drastic. Mostly concerned with the field of research targets, so anything to do with the methodology. And the resources they used to engage with that were mostly negative judgment. So I'll show you an example. So here you have just 2 sentences from some of those high achieving texts. And so you can see they use underline, that is what they're engaging with, so it's a position in the original paper, and then they engage with it through relating it to other sources, to develop it, to support, to align it, to endorse it. And there is very little attitude or very little judgment, and hardly any mention in this case of the methodology. So that was very typical of the students who did quite well. And on the other hand, the students who didn't do so well, and that was quite often, I mean, every semester I still had a few students doing this. And so obviously my message to them, telling them it's critical thinking is not about criticizing, engaging with those sources, is not about dismissing them, still didn't really work. So you can see here the targets of their evaluation. So basically what they are interested in the text, what they want to engage with, is related to the methodology. So we've got experiments, methods, findings, sampling, etc. These are the kind of main theses they say. The research is limited, cannot be generalized. The methods are not conclusive. So this is a kind of engagement that would work with a majority of empirical studies. They never mention the actual field of study. So you can see here the targets, the authors, and the type of language that goes on. And that's what I meant. It's quite harsh sometimes. Like, you know, this is a year 1 at uni, and you know, they're commenting on postdoc or professors, and they're just saying, well, you know, that really lacks credibility, or it's cued by bias. And I'm just trying to tell them, come on, guys, you know, this is not even their own discipline, which obviously is part of the problem. But so I just started to ask myself, so, you know, if with SFL, we're thinking what is shown in the text reflects their worldview, right? So somehow that tells me what is it they see that they prioritize in the text, what is their understanding of what critical thinking entails then. And so it's clear with the low achieving students that they think of critical thinking as evaluating knowledge claims. So that's a fairly basic, usual way to understand critical thinking. So the problem is not really there. But then you can see that they associate this to methodology accuracy. So the knowledge claim is valid if the methodology was accurate in order to get there. And then more problematically is that that methodology is evaluated in quantitative terms. So that's why we have variability, credibility, bias, robust sampling. So all of this discourse is really to do with the quantitative type of paradigm. And so that tells me that this is what they expect the requirements of the task is. So I just wondered then why. And so to go back to what SFL is quite useful to for, that way that we can kind of extrapolate or go back into the context to explain what our students are doing. So I just wondered, so what has led to things being the way they are, right, in those texts? Why do they approach this? And so I kind of looked a bit further. I looked at their disciplines because, of course, critical thinking is disciplinary based as well. So I looked at their disciplines, but we have a range in those groups. We have a range of disciplines, and it didn't seem to really be a very important factor. So I had many engineers who wrote exactly what I expected, and so it didn't seem to be that. So I just went a bit further than that first context, which is the discipline, and I went a bit broader into maybe the rest of the curriculum at NUS, which is becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. And then maybe their schooling experience, and then the broader social context and how critical thinking is discussed or conceptualized in Singapore. And so I think that's where I kind of found where it probably is coming from, because a lot of the conceptualization and discourse around critical thinking at the policy level, the schooling level, tends to go towards that the idea that critical thinking is about evaluating methodology, and the methodology is likely to be empiricist, or at least quantitative. And so I think that is what shapes the students, or these students' understanding of critical thinking expectations. So that means that the problem is not really solvable at the level of the assignment. It's not really a problem that the students don't understand the assignment. It's more that they have a very different disposition towards critical thinking, or understanding of what it entails. So this time, I've just actually showed them that table with the targets, and I've just told them, if that's what you're doing, then that's not what we want. We want you to talk about the actual content, the findings, and so on. So I'll see if that's worked. Maybe it's not, that those kind of dispositions maybe are not something that can be changed so easily.